Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on assessing AI labels on political ads in 2024. I am Quinta Jurecic. I'm a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a senior editor at Lawfare, and I'm very excited for this panel discussion with a range of excellent panelists. So we have with us Julie Sweet, who's the Director of Advocacy and Industry Relations at the American Association of Political Consultants Foundation, Scott Babwah Brennen, who's the Director of the NYU Center on Technology Policy, Berin Szóka, who's the President and founder of TechFreedom, and Jim Dunstan, who's Senior Counsel at TechFreedom. And of course, this event is co-sponsored by all of these great organizations. I want to dive in with kind of an overview of the existing regulatory framework that is on the table when we're talking about assessing AI labels on political ads. Scott, you at the Center on Technology Policy have taken a pretty close look at state-level regulation, not only on AI, but tech policy generally, on the state level in recent years. Can you give us kind of a sense of what the regulatory landscape looks like right now at the state level when it comes to the use of AI in political ads?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks. Thank you. In brief, I guess like 20 states or a little more than 20 states now regulate AI and political ads in one way or another. And big picture, there's three types of laws that we see at the state level. The first and the majority of the states require disclaimers on some ads, political ads that contain generative AI. And there's actually quite a bit of variation in what exactly that includes. Some are limited to just like deceptive or materially deceptive content. Others are written in a way that would cover most synthetic or generated content. Second, a couple of states ban certain types of synthetic content in political ads. Notably, one law in California was just enjoined in October, I think. And then third, we see this, California has its own sort of law, which is about platforms, and it requires platforms to have a way for users to report when they see a deceptive political ad containing AI, and then it requires the platform to action it in some way. And this one was just challenged by X a couple weeks ago, I think, and I don't think we've had a ruling one way or another there. So those are the three kind of main types of laws that we see at the state level.
And I think it's fair to say that the bulk of action has really been at the state level here, but I do want to take a moment to discuss what things have looked like at the federal level, or the absence of things on the federal level, both in terms of the executive branch and, of course, with Congress. So Berin, maybe let me start with you, and then Jim, I'd love to get your thoughts as well. What does the state of regulation on AI and political ads look like federally?
Well, as with so many things, essentially deadlocked at the agency that probably should be handling this, if any agency is going to do that. The Federal Elections Commission is designed to be deadlocked. It's unique as a federal regulatory agency in having an equal number of commissioners from each side, so the agency essentially can't act on anything controversial. So the FEC hasn't done anything. And because the FEC hasn't done anything, there is a sort of perceived vacuum or a political vacuum into which the Federal Communications Commission has stepped. The FCC has proposed a rule that would apply to political ads online and would require disclosure of the fact that there was any kind of AI tool used in the generation of the ad. This raises a number of problems, and the threshold one is what counts as the use of an AI tool. So my colleague Jim and I filed comments on this and noted at the outset that, and I'll let Jim speak to this, that essentially that would cover everything. Any tool that uses anything that's really sophisticated under the FCC's rule could count as an AI-generated tool. And if that applies, it would the proposed rule on which the FCC recently sought comment, the FCC would require a label to be attached to that rule. And it's important to note here This is different from how the disclosure requirements have worked in the past. In the past, disclosure requirements have been applied to the party that runs the ad, right? They're the ones, when you hear, for example, I'm so and so and I paid for this ad, that's something, as Julie can talk to us about, that's something that the political campaign themselves attaches to the ad. In this case, the FCC, because they don't have jurisdiction over those people, they would propose to require that the online or other platforms, any of the various broadcasters, satellite radio, there are a few other parties that are subject to this, cable companies, but notably not online providers, that they would be required to attach that label or to ensure that it applies. So I'll stop there and let Jim jump in because he's really our FCC lead.
Yeah, so two things. First of which was the timing of the FCC's. They issued the notice of proposed rulemaking. I think it was virtually 90 days or so before the election. And the idea that you could go from a cold start at an agency like the FCC to get rules in place in time for the election was really pretty much nonsensical. And of course, nothing happened. There wasn't any rules issues. I think fortunately that they didn't do anything, because if they had, it would have really put the whole election into turmoil, as people would have tried to scramble at the last minute, to do it. The second thing is, and we pointed this out, and we actually did an infographic in our comments. The definition of AI that the FCC used was not some of the other AI definitions that we've seen in other statutes, like 15 U.S.C. 9401 sub 3, but rather was sort of made up of a whole cloth as to what constitutes AI. And always, whenever I'm in any sort of legal discussion with anybody about AI, the first step I always say is, how do you define AI? Because it is such a difficult term to define. But the FCC included in what is AI, quote, computational technology used in creating political ads. Well, we, as sort of tongue-in-cheek, as a joke, put a big fat red label on the cover of our comments saying, warning, these comments were created using computational technology, therefore this disclosure is necessary. I mean, literally under that definition, any computer used to make a political ad would require a disclaimer. And that, just the use of a computer would, but things like Photoshop, things like Audacity to pull, pops out of audio files would require this disclosure. And as a practicing FCC lawyer for 40 years, were I still representing broadcast stations, I would have told every single one of them, you got to slap a label on every single ad that goes up. And of course, that is going to lead us into Scott and Julie, kind of what would have happened, if every single broadcast ad you saw had this warning label on it, when no online ads would have been required to do it. And that's kind of where we were. And as I said, fortunately, we didn't get this absolute chaos weeks or days before the election. So now we can sort of, as a postmortem, say, okay, how can this work going forward? But that's where we are. There's nothing at the federal level that actually made it into rules before the election. But don't think that this is a dead letter before the agencies, because they're clearly going to try and do something before the midterms in 2 years.
And in terms of Congress, of course, there have been proposals put on the table, but I think to pretty much nobody's surprise, nothing moved forward pre-election, and it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of momentum at the moment, although of course we'll see what happens in the new Congress, and I do want to come to that at the end of our conversation. Julie, let me turn to you and ask, from your perspective, as someone who's looking at this more as a political consultant, as someone who works with campaigns, what does this regulatory landscape look like in practice for people who are potentially thinking about using AI in generating political ads?
Challenging is an understatement. 19 states, question at the federal level, threat of federal regulations, unclear definitions, inconsistent labeling requirements from state to state, inconsistency in what is AI, what is And really the purpose of these laws, I think, right? There are, Scott outlined kind of the three buckets of state laws that we've seen. And I think the FCC and the FEC would kind of fall into those categories. But there's also the question of purpose and intent. Like, is the purpose and the intent of these laws to regulate the AI, or is the purpose and intent of these laws to stop misinformation? And most of the state laws you'll see in like that the state has a compelling interest to prevent misinformation about election administration and or candidates, right? So that people can participate in democracy in an informed and accurate way. But what we have seen, and I think what Scott is going to talk about on the research, is that dramatically varies by the kind of language that is used in these laws and required on these disclaimers. But like, I think that there's a couple of important points that I want to make. Is the first is that AI is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for deepfakes and or misleading content, right? Is that you can have an AI generated ad that is entirely truthful, full of citations and everything else, and it would require a label. And you can also have organic content that denotes and illustrates a feeling that is AI generated that may not carry a disclaimer for one or more reasons. So that's part of the challenge of this all of these regulations. I think the other point that I want to make is that the AAPC, political consultants, and our membership, we do make and distinguish between the use of the technology and deep fakes, right? Is that deep fakes, in our estimation, is false and misleading statements, which violates our code of ethics. And so we agree with lawmakers that we need to dissuade and work towards transparency that limits the amount of disinformation and misinformation that might be out there. However, regulation of the tool and labeling of a tool in the process may not be the most effective way to get at that, because what we are concerned about is the what, not the how. And a lot of these bills, by just blatantly saying there is an AI generated, or this is manipulated, digitally altered, that speaks to the how, which is not particularly informative to the public or to the viewers or to the audience about the what or the content of the speech. We're innovators. We are people who want to find new ways to communicate with voters and engage them in the democratic process in a world of which the information ecosystem is more and more siloed and disaggregated. It's harder to find people to engage them in our democracy. And so these tools are a method for doing that. But at the same time, we understand that there is a huge responsibility that political consultants have in the role of democracy that we play, right? Because we are the ones who speak to the voters. We are the ones who help voters understand what is happening in their world and how to feel about the politics. And so we don't just get to break stuff, and going viral is not a strategy. That means our strategies are well-researched and data-driven. But that's why this is hard, because the research is still unclear and the regulatory environment is just all over the place.
So I want to ask you a follow-up. Before I do, I should say to the audience, we are going to be taking audience questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'll read them out over the course of the discussion or at the end. So Julia, to turn back to what you just said, I mean, I think that gets to something that we'd been joking about earlier in terms of, what this election looked like in terms of the use of AI and the use of deepfakes. There was a lot of commentary in advance of the election about how, deepfakes were going to bring about an information apocalypse. Nobody was going to know what was true. I think it's fair to say that that didn't happen. But I'm curious for your perspective on what role AI played and deepfakes as a subset of that in this election. And after you, I definitely want to open it up to see if any of the rest of the panelists have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I certainly want to pick up back off of some of the research that Scott is going to talk about. I think I'll first jump to some of the kind of practical implications of the regulations and the uncertainty. Well, first is that just a lot of the tools aren't quite where they need to be, right? Full video editing and like video production, generative AI isn't quite there. It's still really fuzzy and you can't piece together a full 30-second ad, but it's going to there and it's going to get there really quick. So what we saw a lot of is kind of static images that are put into video content that may be dropped into video, or we might have seen a lot of like voiceover in audio content where we did see it. But beyond kind of what we in your face stuff that is what we would presume is the stuff that lawmakers are really trying to get after, right? Like the video ads that folks were the big doom and gloom stuff. Like we saw it kind of everywhere in tactics, right? It is used in the editing software, as Jim and Berin were talking about. It's in the script writing, it's in the campaign messaging and development, it's the modeling and the analytics, which it's been there for a very long time. That's optimizing the targeting for more better and more efficient resource allocation. We saw it in chatbots for voter engagement and more. So it kind of was everything, but it wasn't in the big deep fake, oh my gosh, the world is ending because, people can think about all the different ways you can have a deep fake. But the problem and the challenge, I think, for our industry is that you ask anyone when and if the labeling requirements kick in for any of these uses. And much like Jim said, you get a big shrug because nobody actually knows. And everybody's really worried about being the guinea pig that gets sued, or they get a private right of action lawsuit against them where they now have to defend whether or not it was generative AI and it meets certain conditions of that state. So, or even if it wasn't a private right of action, but there is an injunction placed upon the ad and the ad has to get taken down and can't be run. But this creates kind of a fraught legal environment within a campaign ecosystem where campaigns are just filing injunctions against the other campaign for threat that there might be use of generative AI that's not labeled or is even labeled, right? So there's just so much uncertainty in how these rules are going to be applied and how the other campaign or outside actors might use these rules to really set back and cost a campaign a whole heck of a lot of money and time.
I want to just jump in here and note, we've seen this kind of weaponization of law in other contexts. I mean, most notably, copyright has been used by campaigns against each other. When someone plays a song or uses a clip of news, it's often been the case that one campaign will throw that out as a way of shutting down the other side's speech, and that's a particular concern when we're dealing with political speech, that uncertainty in the law will create room for the law to be weaponized as a kind of political lawfare, and that can go both ways.
Yeah, and Julie, you said, I think something that was really wonderful. You started talking about the what, not the how, and we're trying to regulate the how, but what they're really trying to regulate the what. But us as First Amendment lawyers, when you start talking about the what, you really are talking about content. And so you really are talking about implicating First Amendment rights. And that, as we should know, I mean, political speech is the most protected speech that we have in this country. And so as soon as we sort of peel back the onion as to what's really going on here, which is you're trying to regulate the what, then instantly we First Amendment lawyers just gotta like, whoa, perk up and say, okay, how do we defend this? How do we analyze this? Which is why we've been talking I want to hear Scott talk about it because, as a First Amendment lawyer, I want to know, what the research sort of shows and whether or not, we can ever tailor regulations that are narrow enough and are specific enough to meet the compelling state interests that they're going to have to under the First Amendment analysis.
Yeah, so Scott, over to you. You have some really interesting research on the effectiveness of labeling on AI ads. What did you find?
Yeah, so we a few months ago we recognized that there are all these state laws and on the books, and but like we couldn't find any sort of empirical analysis of the sort of impact that they might have. And so we ran an experiment, an online experiment, where we got to create some political disinformation and then label it in different ways and see what effect it had. And I'll try to do this really quickly, right? So 3 key findings and 3 key takeaways. So first, AI labels hurt the candidates that use generative AI and even resulted in a backfire effect for attack ads. And what I mean by this is when there was an AI label, we saw a reduced opinion of the candidate in terms of trustworthiness and appeal, reduced perception of the ad accuracy, and a reduced intention to share. Now, for attack ads, basically we saw that happen on the attacker and nothing happened on the attackee. That might make sense, so that's why we're saying the backfire effect. Two, these effects were largely because when respondents saw the label, they lowered their assessment of members of their own party, but there was no, or nonpartisan candidates, but there was no effect on members of the opposite party. That sort of makes sense, right? Like they're already pretty low, and so it's hard for them to go lower. And then third, label effects were small, and I think this is really important to remember. Many viewers didn't even notice labels, but what that means is that design and wording really matter. Now, 3 takeaways from this. One, this goes back to Julie's point, which is essential, which is like, what are these labels trying to do? I'd say, one way to think about it is labels are trying to decrease trust in bad content and increase trust in good content. But really, we saw this, labels reducing trust sort of across the board, suggesting, right, this sort of broad or blunt intervention. 2, now, Julie, please keep me honest here, but my understanding of the empirical literature is that political ads don't really have much of an effect on candidate choice, but where they can have an impact is on mobilization, on fundraising, right? These are ads for your own party, but that's where we saw the most significant impact, suggesting sort of outsized effects. And then third, as I sort of already said, design clearly matters here. But I'll just note that the way the regulations are written, which are very prescriptive about like the size that the label needs to be, the colors, the wording, right? It doesn't really give any sort of room for experimentation to try to make labels more effective. And we have really no research on how to make labels more effective, right? We don't know what wording is best. We don't know the duration or like when it should show up. But there's isn't really any room in the regulations to try to test that out.
Yeah, Julie, I'd love to get your thoughts here.
Well, there's another study that came out about the same time that Scott's research was published from a group called Higher Ground Labs, and they did a study where essentially they took human-made ad, human plus AI ad, AI plus human ad, and a totally 100% AI-generated ad. And they essentially compared the persuasion effects of each of those ads. And they found that there was generally the generative AI created ad 100% was pretty close to as effective. We will spare this audience on the debate about or on the effectiveness of persuasion advertising, but that they found that it's generally as persuasive as kind of the human plus AI content. So what that tells us is that generally the public audiences don't really care or know or distinguish between content that is AI generated and content that is not AI generated. So we do know then, if we take those 2 studies together, that once you slap a label on it, that it does affect audiences' perception of the advertising because they're responding to the label and not the content or what has generated that content. So certainly there's going to be a lot more studies done, but putting those kind of 2 studies together. So, and I take you back to where I kind of in my intro where I talked about that we are a data-driven group of people, right? Like there's a lot of money that goes into this. There's a lot of studying, there's a lot of polling, there's a lot of surveys, focus groups. We test down to like very small percentages and to determine the effect in this of an ad. And so if we see that there is likely a backfire effect, as Scott said, then we're not going to use that kind of advertising because we don't want to cause harm to our candidate ultimately. And we're not entirely sure what the effect is, right? Because it costs money to determine what the positive effect and you have to weigh the persuasion effect against the whether you're using resources efficiently, right? So it's always kind of that balance test. So I think what so the challenge here is that the research is kind of shows that the label is the thing that we should be concerned about, and that the public has more acceptance of this technology if they are unaware that the technology is being used. Now, that's a big question for transparency, but I think as we think more and more about how AI is becoming ubiquitous through political advertising more broadly, and how it is that we consume information, right? Like ChatGPT is becoming an information platform, and they just announced today that they are considering allowing advertising through their chatbot, right? Like that means that we are going to be more and more exposed to generative AI content. And if the generative AI tool is the thing that's feeding you the content that it has created, how do you label?
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, and I feel like from what you describe, and Scott, from what you describe as well, it feels like you can imagine a set of incentives here that basically move away from, campaigns that are trying to follow the regulations using AI and move toward bad actors who simply don't care about the regulations being much more willing to engage in these kinds of tools. I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which, some kind of deepfake or AI generated piece of content could, mislead people, but it does seem like a potentially negative set of incentives. Is that fair?
Well, I think if I just jump in, as I think we have a few challenges. One is this kind of counter speech question that I think Jim and Berin were kind of speaking to, is that the Supreme Court has said counter speech is the most effective remedy we have to kind of bad speech, right? You can't regulate it, but you can offer an opportunity, or counter speech is the way to counteract speech that you don't like. But by discouraging the adoption of these tools, by having an inconsistent kind of regulatory environment and whatnot, that means that voters are unlikely to hear or see the counter speech because it won't be as effective, it won't be as inexpensive as the disinformation. So it's harder to get the accurate and truthful information out to voters in response to the disinformation and the misinformation. I think I'm also concerned about just our workforce and the upskilling that's necessary to deploy these tools. And if we're not incentivizing, but rather discouraging upskilling, that we just won't have the people to compete against the bad actors who are intentionally spreading the disinformation. And then there's people who are far smarter than me who have coined the phrase the implied truth effect, right? That again, it's kind of the same problem, is that if you see an ad up on broadcast that is labeled, but you see a misinformation ad that is on digital, because the FCC doesn't regulate digital space, then they're more likely to trust the misinformation on the digital space than the labeled ad on the broadcast space. And the same can be true across any of the platforms, that the bad actors are the ones who are least likely to label their content, right? The people who are spreading disinformation aren't going to say, well, I'm going to spread misinformation, but I'm going to do it legally and responsibly according to the state regulations, right? The folks who are doing that are the ones, what we know from the research is that the people who label it are automatically going to be distrusted, even if it's truthful. Whereas the folks who are not labeling it, but maybe spreading false information, will be trusted. And that just makes the matters all the worse.
And Julie,
I want to just combine a point that Julie just made with Scott's earlier point. Julie didn't quite say this, but what she's really, I think, getting at is that the counter speech that we need to counter false speech, those are the responsible actors that are going to label their content. And that it's not just that it makes it more expensive and that it's a burden on them. The real burden is what Scott noted, that the label itself makes people distrust the content. So the real cost here is effectively taxing counter speech in the sense of making people less likely to trust it, which is really perverse.
well, and following on that, Julie and Scott, in our prior discussions, is the fact that it's also the speed with which you can counter the disinformation. If you can't use AI because the labeling is going to get you a negative response, that means you have to use more traditional ways to develop your counter speech, which is slower, and so it slows down the speed of debate. And so, in legal terms, there's the old adage about what is best what we need is more speech, not less speech. But in these times, what we need is faster speech, not slower speech, to counter any misinformation that's out there. So it seems like it's a double, or maybe even a squared double whammy. Because if you can't use the AI in the counter speech, it slows it down, or you take the hit. You take the hit on it.
Let me just remind any listeners, if you're interested in asking us a question, you can use the Q&A function. Jim and Berin, I want to turn to you to talk more about the legal challenges that efforts at regulation are facing. We've touched on the First Amendment issues, but I do think it's worth digging into them here. What kind of First Amendment issues do these efforts at regulation raise? What have they faced so far in the courts, and what are you anticipating? Whichever one of you wants to jump in first.
Well, I'll start, and I'll just note that we've talked both about the state laws and about the FCC's rule. We've given the audience more of a sense of what's in the FCC's rule. So that's a regulation, as Julie put it, of the what. It says if you're using an AI tool, you have to label it as such. That's one mode of regulating here. Scott could speak to what all of the state laws cover because they vary, but I'll just note that one of those was just litigated. California's law was just enjoined, which means that there was a preliminary decision saying that it likely violated the First Amendment and it would not be allowed to go into effect. That was in October. And that law is different. That law is not about AI as such. It's about content, political. So it's like the FCC rule in that it's political ads, but the requirement applies to content that is materially deceptive. And in particular, what that means is and again, remember the difference is that the state can regulate political actors directly instead of the platforms, right? That's why these approaches are different. So the California law says that a person, committee, or other entity may not, with malice, knowingly distribute an ad or other election communication containing materially deceptive content of a candidate running for office. And that would mean, for example, someone being portrayed as doing or saying something that the candidate did not do or say, if the content is reasonably likely to harm the reputation of that person or the electoral prospects of the candidate. Okay, so that is the attempt of California to try to lawyer through a law that they thought would be well-tailored, right? Because you have all those caveats in there. You have to have malice, you have to have knowledge, there has to be a showing of harm to the candidate. And in the end, those were not enough. In fact, none of those provisos made any difference at all. And I think it's worth unpacking why. And I think it suggests this decision, although it's a preliminary one, confirms a lot of what we said in our comments with the FCC, which we filed just around the same time. And it suggests that it's going to be very difficult for any of these laws to stand up. And the crucial thing to start with here is that I think all of these laws are targeted at political ads. Now that sounds reasonable because you think, well, that's where the problem is. That's what we're concerned about. And that's where the government's interest is greatest. But the problem is that if you start targeting a particular kind of speech, like political speech, certainly if you're not dealing with something that's purely commercial advertisements, but you're dealing with non-commercial speech and you're targeting a particular kind of non-commercial speech, it's not content neutral. If it's not content neutral, you are probably stuck dealing with the highest form of scrutiny. That's strict scrutiny. And Jim alluded to that earlier, right? The analysis of strict scrutiny is, do you have a compelling government interest? And in that particular case, the court skipped by that and said, we'll stipulate to California having a compelling interest. Now we are not actually so sure that that's going to work ultimately when these things get litigated. But California's court said, even if there's a compelling government interest in protecting against false political speech, which other courts have said there's not, but even if there were, that the California law would fail that test because under strict scrutiny, it's not narrowly tailored. There are other things that California could have done. It has all these problems that we've discussed here on this call. There are other less restrictive means that could be available to the state, and that would include things like funding voter education. I mean, the state could buy ads, for example, that alert people to the fact that there is manipulated media. I mean, all sorts of things that the state could do. And it's not the responsibility of a private plaintiff to say that to make a list and show the state didn't do X, Y, and Z. The state has to show that. That's the state's burden under strict scrutiny. So if any of these laws wind up in strict scrutiny, they're dead. That's it. I mean, there's just no way that they're going to survive. And in particular, the states and the FCC have a real problem here in that they're targeting not just a particular kind of speech, but the most highly protected kind of speech, which is political content. And it doesn't matter that it's paid political content, right? That might change the analysis for commercial speech, for advertisements, but for political ads, it's political speech. The fact that it's paid for does not matter. So the only hope here that any of these laws have is escaping strict scrutiny. And the only hope they have for that is this argument that for disclosure, that there's a different standard. And it's true that the courts in dealing with campaign finance and in some political disclosures have applied what they call exacting scrutiny. And it's not clear what that means. Some courts have suggested that it's somewhere between strict scrutiny and the next tier of scrutiny, which is intermediate scrutiny. In our comments, we note that many courts have said that there's really no difference. Several circuit courts have said that effectively the analysis is the same. It's really unclear, but I wouldn't bet any money on these laws surviving under exacting scrutiny because it appears that the analysis will be the same, which once again is you have to show compelling government interest and probably protecting people against false political speech is probably not a compelling government interest. The courts have said that repeatedly. And that's why you get into, and the California decision illustrates this, you get into a situation where the state of California had to argue, well, this is like the Supreme Court's Alvarez decision from 2012, where the Supreme Court recognized that there are certain circumstances where false speech is not protected by the First Amendment. So most obviously commercial false speech, right? If you deceive people about what's in your product and you lie about its health properties, for example, that's false speech. It's not protected speech. If you defame someone, that's not protected speech. And the Supreme Court noted a few other categories where, for example, lying about the time and place of an election or how you vote might be unprotected. Lying about whether you've received medals of valor as a soldier might be unprotected. But to make a long story short, the court in that circumstance said, this isn't like any of those categories. So Alvarez doesn't help the state of California there. It's not likely to help any of these other states. That's just to give you an overview of how these cases have been decided. But I'll just close by noting that in that case, the court didn't really have to deal with the exacting scrutiny question because they found that the particular disclosure that was required by California was so overwhelming. I mean, it had to be on the screen at all times while the ad was showing. And they found that that was so burdensome that it effectively drowned out speech. And so in that, again, preliminary injunction, not fully litigated, the court said, we can easily predict that the state is going to lose, so we enjoin the law. And that just bodes very ill for other laws, even if the disclosure is less burdensome.
Yeah, and I want to get back to my sort of the speed of response that we talked about before. And as Berin was going through all the sort of carve-outs and caveats in the California law, well, think about that. That means every single one of those would have to be litigated in every single case, which means that every single commercial ends up in court. And when you're, run up to an election and you're throwing ads out, on a 24/7 basis, you're just going to have lawyers and judges going round the clock full time litigating these types of things. And ultimately, it just means the system just can't work if you have to be so careful and have so many caveats and definitions and carve outs as to what, when the law applies and when the law doesn't. It just becomes unworkable almost immediately.
I also want to suggest, and I certainly don't speak for the First Amendment attorneys over here, but I do think that there are options here, right? As that there are conversations and discussions and about other ways of informing audiences of either AI, that content was AI generated, as well as a lot of other kind of disclaimer information that may be required, right? I like to use the phrase a dynamic disclaimer as opposed to a static disclaimer that we see required in a lot of these state laws, which is slapping a little box on with a bunch of language at the bottom that says one thing or another that is unchanging throughout the course of the ad, regardless of what a viewer might actually be seeing on their screen at any given second. But if you have more of the kind of the content provenance, the watermarking, Assemblyman Voorhees out of New York is looking at kind of a C2PA kind of framework for more of a dynamic disclaimer. But one of the interesting things about that is that there's a couple of other organizations out there that have that you could append your stand by your ad and your campaign finance disclosure could be part of that. You could also include citation information. And there's a wonderful, rich world of information that you might be able to supply to your audiences if you're not just slapping some static language on the bottom of a 30-second advertisement.
So Jim and Berin, I'm curious for your perspective. I mean, what is regulation that would be workable in your view under the First Amendment? Is something like Julie just described, would that meet the legal standards that it needs to clear in court? Or is this really a problem where, it's the FEC's job and the FEC is deadlocked, and so there's sort of very little that can be done?
Well, just to be clear, having the FEC do this, it might put the agency on firmer ground in terms of its claim of authority, which we haven't even talked about, right? So let's set to the side whether the FCC really has the authority to do what it's proposing to do here. So if the FEC did it, that at least would be clearer. It would help in the First Amendment analysis in that the requirements would be applied on the speaker. Now, when you apply requirements on the platform, which is what the FCC would be doing, I think the burden is much greater because you get into this problem where you have another kind of chilling effect, which is that the platform itself may be discouraged from carrying the ads at issue. Now, we note in our comments that for political speech, for political ads for broadcasters, they probably make a lot of money on these ads. It's well known that this is one of the cash cows for broadcasters. So broadcasters, maybe they want to eat that cost. But in the online context, it's certainly true that they've decided not to bother with political ads, many of these platforms. Twitter only recently turned them back on. Facebook still, Meta still does not allow them. And there's another decision we haven't mentioned here. The Fourth Circuit dealt with this in the case of a Maryland law that applied to online platforms. That was in the McManus case. So that law was passed after the concern about Russian interference in the 2016 election, and it required a disclosure of the sources of funding for internet-based ads. And the court in that circumstance noted that one of the problems with placing burdens on platforms is that platforms may decide just not to bother to carry the speech or to change how they prioritize it. It could be any number of those responses. So that's a particular problem with going after the platforms themselves, and that problem is somewhat reduced by directly regulating the political actors, as campaign ads have always been regulated, right? That's what the FEC does. That's what federal campaign law does. That's what states do. They regulate the private parties themselves and require them to put labels and disclosures and endorsements in their ads. That would certainly be a better approach. And Julie, I'd have to hear a little more about what you have in mind about provenance. But I'm skeptical that really anyone's going to figure out a constitutional law, but I will say that the things we've been discussing today are a waste of everyone's time because they are sucking up oxygen from the legislative process. And we already know that they're not constitutional. They're going to fail. So if you were really serious about this, I think the way you would deal with it, if you know that the FEC is deadlocked, and you know that the FCC, it has only limited jurisdiction and it's only over the broadcasters. And we haven't even talked about this, but another problem with the FCC getting involved is they can't regulate online ads. So you're always going to have this under-inclusiveness problem, which is itself a First Amendment problem, because if you put the political ad labels, if you put labels on political ads for broadcasting, satellites, and cable service, but they don't show up on the internet, that's very confusing to ordinary consumers. They're not going to understand.
And nobody's going to put $1 million behind a truly deceptive advertisement, right? That is either targeting election workers or targeting candidates. That's the least likely place that you're going to see disinformation or misinformation.
Oh, Julie, can you just elaborate on that? So you're going to see that information in what kinds of content?
Right, when you put up a broadcast advertisement, as of right now, the broadcasters can require particularly for candidates and for third-party ads, so your independent expenditures, that political candidates are the least subject to citation and kind of rigor of the argument, right? Because they have political speech. But your independent expenditure and your PACs are going to be much more likely to be subject to a takedown of the ad if they can't back up the claims made in that advertisement with citations, right? Because the broadcasters are going to have a higher threshold. And so this is what happens is oftentimes there's litigation behind the scenes about whether or not there is truth in advertising by the third-party actors. So having an AI generated ad with misinformation is the least likely place you're going to see that is because they're going to have to take down the ad one way or the other, right? If it's proven to be disinformation, they'll have to take down the ad, whether or not it's AI generated or not. So the place that you're most likely to see it is through the organic content where you don't have a stand by your ad requirement or any other disclaimer requirements. And you're going to see it in your digital spaces where you don't have the same type of rigor applied and evaluation made by the broadcasters and the platforms for truth in advertising, so to speak. I don't know if that's the formal language of truth in advertising, but that's the expectation.
And of course, notably, all these laws that we're talking about here today are about paid political content, so they don't deal with that problem. So you have, the attempt to regulate is only dealing with a piece of the problem, and as Julie notes, it may be the smallest piece of the problem. And that creates all sorts of perverse results about people thinking that certain content, if it weren't trustworthy, if it were AI generated, there would be a label. Well, there may not be a label. So, Quinta, I'm very skeptical that any of this, that there is any room for regulation here. But I'm even more skeptical that state legislators or Congress are going to figure this out on their own. So I think if you were really serious about this, the way to deal with this, and I know this sounds like a dodge, but we have now almost 2 years before the next election. If Congress were serious about this, they would actually convene an expert panel commission to study this and bring together real experts with real quantitative data, with real world experience, like Julie and her colleagues, and then lawyers who could help to work through what might be constitutional. And that's maybe one way where you might be able to identify some room for legislation. But short of that, we're just going to keep throwing spaghetti against the wall. It's not going to stick. It's going to get struck down. And this conversation isn't going to change.
And, Quinta, to answer your question, is there a pathway forward? Traditionally, I would have said, well, labeling might be, because traditionally that's how we have sort of regulated. It is the how, not the what. But that's why I'm so fascinated by the work that Scott's done, and I hope there are 100 more studies like his. And if they start coming out, sort of the majority of which indicate that the label itself becomes a negative and a problem, then even trying to approach this through a labeling regime in itself, might not be able to pass constitutional muster. You can't even get close to the what if the how ends up being so detrimental to speech. If the how chills speech, then you never get to the what, which is what you really want, which is disinformation. And so I think we're actually farther away, from a pathway than we were a couple of years ago with this. And again, that's if the future studies, which I hope Scott gets lots of funding to do, and other people get funding to do, end up demonstrating that this isn't a one-off, that this is in fact the public just reacts negatively to a label writ large, then any labeling regime just has to go off the table.
Yeah, so Scott, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Do empirical studies end up actually undermining the prospects for regulation?
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, the problem is, like, as a social scientist, like, one study is, I mean, I'm not gonna say it's meaningless, but like we need a lot more work here. This is one online experiment. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I need to say, like, I feel like we've spent an hour now just like crapping all over the idea of labels on political these labels in probably for good reason. But I also know that, like, so many of the regulators here, I actually think are acting in good faith, that they are concerned about this content, and this is the solution that they've come up on, and yeah, it might not be the best solution, but I want to just I don't know, I feel like I just want to acknowledge that, like, I have some sympathy for their concern here.
I don't think they're acting in bad faith. I think they're badly advised on both the empirical research that you've discussed, the realities of what Julie has described, and the law. And it's in that sense that I think they're wasting their own time. And that's why I think you have to do this through some more expert body. And in an ideal world, that might be the FEC. I don't think that's going to happen. But you could imagine, if Congress doesn't set up some expert body. I mean, here's an example or an idea. And I'm not an FEC lawyer, so I don't know the answer to this, but I assume that the FEC has, like every other federal agency, an advisory body, like under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. If the FEC FACA body isn't already working on this, they absolutely should be. If you're really concerned about this, that would be one very concrete ask for the current chair of the FEC. Because that's where the expertise, the outside expertise, should reside and could be directly channeled to the FEC. And it doesn't matter that the FEC may be unable to act on it. A report from the FACA body to the FEC laying out what is legally possible and could practically matter could be a roadmap for Congress.
FEC, you have your marching orders. We do have one audience question. If you have another, please send it in. From Chris McIsaac, who asks if there were any attempts to enforce the new state laws during the recent election via fines, injunctions, etc.
The only example that I am aware of at this point was that there was an advertisement that was run in Indiana. There was a short period, a short snippet in the ad that was used generative AI to create a static image. And the ad was released, put up on broadcast. It was quickly identified as having used generative AI in the construction of the ad, which the entirety of the ad was pretty much created in by editing tools. And quickly they took down the ad, they applied the Indiana disclaimer, and then they relaunched the ad saying we shipped the wrong version of it. So they updated the ad on their own because of there was some Twitter activity as far as I could tell. But that's really the only example that we saw that I am aware of at this point. But I'm sure, Scott can also speak to you, is that we just didn't see a whole lot of paid generative AI created advertising, right? We've seen a lot of the stuff about deep fakes, but we also just didn't see the use of generative AI in the creation of ads that warranted that disclaimer. Again, speaking to the kind of the regulatory environment, the fear of litigation, the fear of the how becoming the story and kind of taking the spotlight off of the message, which as political consultants you never want to do, right? And just the lack of research and impact of these labelings and even just AI in general on voters' perceptions. All of those kind of create an environment where folks weren't quick to adopt this cycle.
And I just want to say really quick, I think what often gets overlooked here is, and I feel weird even saying this, but like these tools aren't necessarily bad, right? Like we can imagine a world in which they actually are kind of helpful to certain campaigns, right? Like smaller, less well-funded campaigns, challengers, right? Like theoretically could use these tools not to make deceptive content, but just to make better looking ads more cheaply. And so, I mean, part of me is like, who really cares if like, or maybe it's a good thing that like, advertisers are not, political advertisers aren't using these tools, but I think there actually is this opportunity. There's this world in which which there's this negative effect that if we're seeing campaigns not using available tools because they're worried about the regulatory environment.
I want to just note here the one thing that really stood out to me in the California decision. So again, there's the FCC rule, which is about whether you're using an AI tool, and some state laws do that. And then there's this other category of state laws like California's that are about things that are materially deceptive. And the court notes here, it says almost any digitally altered content, when left up to an arbitrary individual on the internet, could be considered harmful. For example, AI-generated approximate numbers on voter turnout could be considered false content that reasonably undermines confidence in the outcome of an election under this statute. In other words, if the scope of the law is about the nature of the content, all sorts of things, not just things that you think of as tools that are used to create the ad or do a voiceover or include an image, but tools that are used to generate the content, like that example, could be subject to regulation. And you can start to see why those things are even more problematic from a First Amendment perspective, because you're talking about not just the sort of the makeup that gets put on speech, but the speech itself. Estimates, projections, calculations. That's going to be really hard to defend in court. And I don't know the answer to this question, but one way to answer the question that's just asked was how many of the laws that have been passed, which I think is 16, how many of those have not been enjoined, and then how many of the ones that have not been enjoined have been enforced? I think we would have heard if there had been significant enforcement actions.
Well, I think it is fair to say this issue is certainly not going to go away anytime soon. Berin, I hope that the FEC will take you up on your offer, or that the new Congress will. I don't know if I'm optimistic, but we can all cross our fingers. And who knows, maybe we'll have some new expert studies or some new hard data from Scott, and we can reconvene and discuss that in the future. So we're going to end here. Thank you all to our panelists, and thank you to everyone attending.
Thanks, Quinta. Thanks all.
Thank you.